You're watching The Legal Breakdown. So, Glenn, some breaking news today. Ahead of Trump's first criminal trial, which is set to begin jury selection on April 15th in Manhattan, Judge Merchan has imposed a gag order on Trump. So, first off, why was this imposed, and what happens if Trump violates it?
Yeah, so District Attorney Alvin Bragg filed a motion seeking this gag order back in February. Why was it imposed? Brian, earlier today, we saw Donald Trump post something naming Judge Merchan's daughter, which we all know instantly puts her in harm's way. Is it a coincidence that immediately after that post, Judge Merchan finally got around to, and this is not a criticism, just an observation, Judge Merchan instantly imposed a gag order, even though this motion had been kicking around for a number of weeks. So, were those two things related? Listen, let's not look a gift horse in the mouth. Donald Trump has been gagged again, at least in part. This actually makes a hat trick of gag orders. Remember, Judge Engoron put one in place in the New York civil fraud trial. Judge Chutkan put one in place in Donald Trump's federal criminal prosecution in D.C. for trying to overturn the 2020 presidential election. And now we have a third gag order that has been put in place by Judge Merchan just weeks before the case is going to begin with jury selection.
And now, if Trump violates that gag order, what's he looking at?
He's looking at monetary fines. He's looking at potentially criminal contempt. And, part of what I have said in the past about Judge Tanya Chutkan, who's presiding over Donald Trump's federal prosecution in Washington, D.C., is Judge Chutkan don't play. And I know that firsthand because I used to try murder cases against her when she was a public defender in the courts of Washington, D.C., and I was a federal homicide prosecutor. Very serious person, very accomplished person, aggressive, fearless, and she has carried that over to her time on the bench. I would say the same thing about Judge Merchan. The more we see of him, the more it's becoming clear he will not play Donald Trump's reindeer games. He has been on top of this. He has been stern. He has been strong. He has been aggressive. And I have a feeling Donald Trump ought not test the bounds of this gag order that Judge Merchan just put in place, because Donald Trump could actually see himself held in criminal contempt, which could mean he would be ordered into confinement, perhaps for a day, perhaps for a week, perhaps for the full extent of the trial, if he cannot behave himself and comply with the gag order.
To that point, do we have any indication thus far that Judge Merchan wouldn't be willing to let Trump run roughshod over his court in the same way that he's done in basically all of his other trials?
We have some, I think, pretty strong indicators. The last couple of hearings, Donald Trump's lawyers have tried to engage in the sort of public relations nonsense where they'll say things like, this should never happen to somebody in the United States. And Judge Merchan would say, stop it. That's not a legal argument. Move on to a legal argument. And then just recently, when Donald Trump's lawyers were trying desperately to delay the trial from starting even beyond April 15th, Judge Merchan just cut the lawyer off mid-sentence and said, I'll see you April 15th. So he does seem to be somebody who's intent on controlling the proceedings, on making sure they are orderly, on making sure that the attorneys don't overstep their bounds as advocates and start becoming, PR flacks for Donald Trump, as some of Donald Trump's lawyers are wont to do. So again, all of the indications are that Judge Merchan is the kind of judge who will control his courtroom, which every judge should do. Now, remember, Judge Merchan presided over the criminal trial of the Trump Organization, where the Trump Organization was convicted of 17 felony counts of a 15-year-long criminal scheme to defraud in the first degree. So he already has a pretty full appreciation of what Donald Trump and his organization are all about. And I look forward to seeing how he presides over this trial. I only wish there were cameras in the courtroom, but we're going to have to rely on the real-time blogging and reporting of the folks who are in the courtroom.
Now, you'd mentioned earlier that Trump attacked the daughter of the judge on one of his Truth Social posts. Based on the gag order itself, though, that was handed down by Judge Merchan, it wasn't explicitly clear that the order would extend to him or his family. So Why not extend that gag order to himself or his own family members?
It's a really curious formulation. And, if we can look at one of the sentences in the gag order, I think it's kind of open to interpretation whether Judge Merchan is including his family members in the gag order. I suggest they should be included because Donald Trump has already endangered Judge Merchan's daughter by naming her, by suggesting where she works. And, Brian, when I saw that, I thought back to being in the courtroom watching the appellate argument in Washington, D.C. on the gag order issue, when one of Donald Trump's attorneys said, hey, he just says the name, he just posts, the name of a witness or a family member of a prosecutor or a judge, and he's not responsible for what his supporters do. And one of the appellate court judges cut him off and said, wait a minute, we see the pattern here. Donald Trump posts the name of somebody and threats ensue. So listen, we all know that when Donald Trump posts the name of one of his perceived enemies or the family member of one of his perceived enemies, what signal is he sending to his, rabid MAGA base? Get him. And that's precisely what happens. The death threats begin to flow in. So here is what Judge Merchan said in his order. He said that Trump will be prohibited from making or directing others to make public statements about counsel in the case other than the district attorney, Alvin Bragg. He's still fair game. Donald Trump can still rail against Alvin Bragg. Counsel in the case other than the district attorney, members of the court's staff and the district attorney's staff, or the family members of any counsel or staff member. And I don't exactly know if when the judge said any counsel or staff member, if he was including the judge's staff, the judge's family members. It's a little bit murky. And I have to say, if I were Alvin Bragg, in an abundance of caution, I might ask the judge to further refine precisely who is covered, because Donald Trump just posted the judge's daughter's name, right? That endangers the judge's daughter. And I think if I were Alvin Bragg, I would say, Judge, can we just revisit who you intended to include and maybe modify by adding a sentence precisely what family members are included in this gag order? Family members of the prosecutors and their staff, family members of the judge and the court staff, because I think what Judge Merchan did was exempt from the gag order not only DA Bragg, but himself, because there's nothing that says you can't talk about the judge. Just as, if you'll recall, Judge Engoron said you can't talk about my staff, but you can talk about me. Judge Chutkan said you can't talk about court staff, but you can talk about me. I've got a thick skin. So it's a little bit curious. It's a little bit of an open question.
Well, it always does feel like judges stop short of gagging defendants from disparaging them. Is that by design?
There's really no design when it comes to what Donald Trump chooses to do, endanger the lives of judges and their family and their staff, prosecutors and their family and their staff, witnesses and their family members, grand jurors, trial jurors. There's no playbook for this. Actually, let me modify that. There is a playbook for this. And the playbook is when you're a defendant on pretrial release in a felony case, if you pose a danger to the community or even one person in the community, you are to be detained pending trial. No judge has ever seen fit to apply the law to Donald Trump as it would be applied to you, me, and darn near everybody else in the U.S.
Right.
If they were on pretrial release, Donald Trump should be detained pending trial. Maybe someday we will see that happen. But the fact that we continue to sacrifice the safety of everybody else, every single person who's involved in the endeavor of trying to hold Donald Trump accountable for his crimes, we sacrifice them all to Donald Trump rather than simply applying the law as it was intended to be applied to Donald Trump, is something that I think we're going to have to do an autopsy on this when Donald Trump is in our rearview mirror and figure out why the institutions of government have not risen to the challenge.
All, by the way, all in like this misguided pursuit of balance or fairness, and what it does instead, because we don't want to look like we're being advantageous to one side over the other, and so we'll grant Donald Trump all these exceptions, all these loopholes, all these benefits. What it does is basically allow him to just completely abuse the system. Like in an effort to not seem too political one way, they're just giving the whole game away to the opposite direction. And that completely advantages Donald Trump.
Yeah, and there's no accounting for why the system has failed to respond the way it ordinarily would. And again, I hope that's something that when we are through this dark episode in our nation's history, we can reassess and retool and recalibrate the institutions of government and actually strive for equal justice for everybody, including the rich, the powerful, the influential, the political, the connected, the white male. How about we apply the law to them as we apply it to everybody else?
Yeah. All right, and let's finish off with this. Glenn, what does it say more broadly that for the third time now, Donald Trump had to be gagged by a judge because he was incapable of not intimidating witnesses and court staff and juries and on and on?
It says that Donald Trump behaves like a petulant child, with apologies to petulant children. And, this is somebody who wants to be entrusted with the power of the presidency. And yet his inclination is that when anybody is involved in trying to hold him accountable for his wrongdoing, what you need to do is resort to thinly veiled calls for violence against those who would try to hold you accountable for your conduct. This is insanity writ large, that we have this person as the Republican candidate for president.
Perfectly put. We'll leave it there. Obviously, we'll continue to stay on top of this case as it continues to progress. Remember, jury selection is beginning just in a couple of weeks here on April 15th. So for those of you watching, if you want to follow along with this case, please make sure to subscribe. The links to both of our channels are right here on this screen. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
And I'm Glenn Kirshner.
You're watching The Legal Breakdown.